December 1944. The Western Front was locked in the grip of a brutal winter. While the German High Command was anxiously trying to turn the tide with a desperate counter-offensive in the Ardennes, not far away, an American general was tightening his gloves, ordering his entire Third Army to pivot 90 degrees in the freezing cold, a bold move never seen before. That was George S. Patton, the man American soldiers called Old Blood and Guts. Without waiting, without hesitation, Patton surged north like a steel storm, determined to break the siege of Bastogne. Across the lines, German generals stared at their maps, unable to believe that the man they thought was pinned down in the snow was the first to launch a counterattack against their flank. Not Eisenhower. Not Montgomery. To the German High Command, it was Patton whose name struck the deepest fear. Because he wasn't just a brilliant tactician, he was unpredictable, fast as lightning, and never took a step back. In the final months of the war, the name George S. Patton was no longer just that of a general. It became the embodiment of initiative, of unrelenting pressure the Nazis could no longer control. And from that, a legend was born, the legend of the man who made the entire German High Command tread carefully with every step he took forward. George S. Patton stood out among Allied commanders not only because of his tactical skill, but also for the fiery presence he carried with him to the battlefield. He always appeared before his troops in a crisp uniform, a pearl-handled pistol at his side, a piercing gaze, and a bold demeanor, as if he were the living embodiment of war itself. For Patton, the battlefield was no place for hesitation. Speed, initiative, and overwhelming firepower were the three principles he placed above all else. One of his most famous sayings was, "Don't tell people how to do things, tell them what to do, and they will surprise you with their ingenuity." That philosophy of leadership not only streamlined battlefield orders, but also encouraged his subordinates to react quickly, adapt with flexibility, and fully exploit any weakness in the enemy's defenses. Under his command, American mechanized divisions moved like whirlwinds, striking directly at soft spots rather than becoming entangled in prolonged engagements. He did not avoid risk, he embraced it as an essential element of victory. German General Alfred Jodl once remarked bitterly, "Patton was very bold. He favored large-scale maneuvers, he accepted great risks, and in doing so, achieved great victories." To his soldiers, Patton was the embodiment of trust, a commander who never stopped, never backed down, and was always ready to lead from the front. He could be hot-tempered and strict, yet he knew how to inspire with thunderous speeches and an unshakable belief that victory would come if they acted faster and struck harder than the enemy. It was that blend of military discipline and a larger-than-life presence that turned Patton into a living symbol while he was still in uniform. To his enemies, he was a figure they could never quite pin down. He was at once daring and methodical, aggressive and coldly precise. One German general described Patton as a man of initiative who moved like lightning, and General Gunther Blumentritt, a seasoned German campaign planner, later wrote, "We rated Patton extremely highly. He came very close to our idea of the classical military commander." That observation speaks volumes. In the eyes of the Germans, who had built their empire on the foundations of blitzkrieg, Patton was one of the few Allied generals who made them feel as though they were facing a refined version of themselves, decisive, fast-moving, relentless, and impossible to stop. And that, above all, was what made them afraid. Patton's brilliance was not defined by forceful commands or theatrical presence alone. It revealed itself most clearly when he set foot on the battlefield, where each of his movements gradually forced the German command to rethink who they were truly up against. In the spring of 1943, the North African front was in turmoil. After the devastating American defeat at Kasserine Pass, the II Corps was left disoriented and demoralized. Patton was handed command in the midst of this chaos. Within just 2 weeks, he rebuilt the entire command structure, reinstated strict discipline, and transformed a broken force into a hardened, organized army. This was not just a change in form. It was a fundamental shift in the way his troops thought, moved, and fought. The Battle of El Gheta came soon after, serving as Patton's first real confrontation with the German army. On March 23, the 10th Panzer Division, one of Germany's most seasoned units, launched a heavy counterattack to drive the Americans off a newly held position. They expected that a swift blow would collapse the fragile American lines. Instead, they ran into a tenacious defense, with coordinated fire support and seamless cooperation between infantry, artillery, and engineers. The formation and discipline stunned the Germans. In less than a month, the force they thought had fallen apart at Kasserine had transformed into a responsive and determined opponent, one capable of resisting and countering with an effectiveness they had not anticipated. It was in that very moment that the name George S. Patton was first marked in red in the German intelligence reports. They recognized the rapid transformation in how the American forces were operating on the battlefield, and at the center of that change stood a commander who was tough, bold, and refused to follow any kind of formulaic response. El Geta was not enough to alter the entire course of the war, but for the German High Command, it marked the point where they were forced to acknowledge. Patton was not just another desk-bound American general following orders by the book. In internal memos, some German officers began to compare him to their own mobile commanders, men capable of reading a move ahead and striking before the enemy even acted. From his very first engagement, Patton compelled his adversaries to rethink their assumptions, no longer dismissing him, but beginning to monitor his every move with close attention. The next campaign, on the island of Sicily, was where Patton pushed his bold tempo and unpredictable style even further, building on what he had initiated in North Africa. At first, the U.S. 7th Army under his command was assigned a secondary role, protecting the left flank of the main British offensive, led by Montgomery. But Patton did not see war through the lens of operational charts. He read it like a chessboard, where the quicker hand could tilt the outcome in their favor. Soon after landing on the island, he quietly adjusted his line of advance. Instead of holding a defensive line as planned, Patton launched a thrust northward over rugged terrain to capture the city of Palermo, a major logistical hub for the Axis. He didn't stop there. He pressed his forces forward in a race toward Messina, with a dual objective: to outpace Montgomery in the race for headlines and to cut off the German and Italian retreat from the island. For the Germans, the Sicily campaign posed a complex challenge, but not one that threw them into panic. With a well-prepared system of delaying defenses, they managed to withdraw nearly 60,000 troops and most of their heavy equipment to the Italian mainland without being destroyed en route. In the eyes of their commanders, Patton's advance, though rapid, did not come as a surprise. One officer who had faced the Americans in Sicily later remarked, "Patton passed through areas we had deliberately abandoned." The Americans fought in a very methodical way, typically advancing only after extensive artillery preparation. There were none of the daring deep thrusts we had expected from a mobile commander. Still, there was one thing they could not deny. Patton acted faster than anyone had anticipated, including his own Allied peers. His initiative, his readiness to break the mold, and his willingness to push past directives for tactical advantage forced the German High Command to reassess their view of this American general. Though he did not land a decisive blow in the Sicily campaign, Patton demonstrated that he was always one step ahead, seizing even the smallest openings to his advantage. After Sicily, the Germans no longer considered Patton someone who would stick to the plan devised by Allied staff. They began to view him as a volatile factor, unpredictable and impossible to ignore. And it was precisely this unpredictability that made him truly dangerous. When the Normandy front shifted from static defense to mobile warfare, that was when the name George S. Patton became a genuine nightmare for the German command. In the summer of 1944, while the Allies were still struggling to break out of the Normandy beaches after D-Day, Patton remained sidelined due to a disciplinary incident. Yet, just 2 months later, he returned like a whirlwind. On August 1, Patton officially took command of the newly formed U.S. 3rd Army. At that exact moment, Operation Cobra tore open a massive breach in the German defensive line. Patton seized the opportunity without hesitation. He wasted no time setting up rear logistics. Instead, he immediately hurled his armored divisions through the gap, driving straight into the German rear. In just a few short weeks, his forces swept across northern France, advancing nearly 500 kilometers and liberating dozens of towns at a pace reminiscent of the German blitzkrieg that had conquered France 4 years earlier, only now it was being turned against them. In Berlin, the movement maps of the Third Army began keeping German generals awake at night. Rather than delivering frontal attacks in traditional fashion, Patton chose unexpected maneuver routes, struck into the rear, destroyed supply lines, and split enemy formations. Once again, he acted before the enemy could react. And this time, it was no longer just about marking his name in red on intelligence reports. The German High Command was forced to focus their full attention on Patton, viewing him as the most dangerous spearhead of the Allied advance. The peak of his offensive momentum came at the Falaise pocket, where Patton attempted to seal off the German 7th Army with a northern pincer strike. Had he not been ordered to halt at Ardennes by higher command, he might have slammed the lid shut and annihilated what remained of the Wehrmacht's main force in Western Europe. Although hundreds of thousands of German troops narrowly escaped, the sheer speed and storm-like pressure of Patton's advance left the German High Command in a state of panic. Field Marshal Walter Model, one of Hitler's most seasoned commanders, uttered bitterly after this campaign, "We are witnessing the collapse of the Western Front." He wasn't speaking of Montgomery or Bradley. What stunned Model was an army group moving at an unimaginable speed, commanded by a general who showed no hesitation, no doubt, and who was bound by no rigid blueprint. In his memoirs, General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the German High Command, later admitted that from the moment the Allies broke out of Normandy and entered the phase of mobile warfare, German leadership understood the Western Front was lost, and it was Patton who had delivered that blow, not only through sheer speed, but by constantly forcing the enemy into a reactive state, leaving them responding instead of commanding. From that point forward, in every planning session held in Berlin, whenever battle maps were unrolled, the arrow representing Patton's advance was always the one under closest watch. He was no longer just a battlefield commander. He had become a strategic threat with the potential to unravel an entire front, if not contained in time. When winter descended on the Ardennes in late 1944, the Germans launched their final major offensive of the war, a desperate attempt to split the Allied front. Bastogne, a key Belgian town, was quickly encircled. Supply lines were severed. American paratroopers, trapped in the cold, ran low on ammunition, food, and hope. German commanders believed they had set a perfect trap that would break the Allied spirit. But while Wehrmacht officers were still debating their next steps, George S. Patton was already shifting the board. In less than 48 hours, he ordered his entire Third Army, which had been marching east, to pivot 90 degrees northward through snow-choked roads and frozen terrain to strike the German flank besieging Bastogne. A winter maneuver of that scale, under such conditions, was deemed impossible by conventional military logic. Even Allied commanders initially dismissed Patton's plan as recklessly overambitious. But Patton didn't just speak, he acted, and on December 26, his troops broke the encirclement and reached Bastogne just as the situation seemed beyond salvation. There was no prolonged artillery preparation, no overwhelming superiority, just speed, surprise, and absolute decisiveness. The German reaction was one of stunned disbelief. They couldn't understand how such a massive army could pivot and move with that kind of speed under brutal winter conditions. Bastogne was not merely a tactical loss. It was proof that Patton could transform a deteriorating situation into a counterstrike that changed the momentum of war precisely when no one else dared to act. From Berlin, German staff officers were forced to admit every tactical calculation would inevitably have gaps if their opponent was Patton. There were no rigid rules, no repeatable predictions. He appeared from unexpected directions, with a speed and resolve that neither Hitler nor the Wehrmacht's top brass were mentally prepared to confront. Bastogne, therefore, was more than a successful rescue mission. It was the moment Patton forced the entire German military apparatus to face a terrifying reality. They were no longer in control. Wherever Patton emerged, their plans could unravel overnight. As 1945 began, and the Third Reich was fracturing from within, Patton didn't slow down. He accelerated. Every mark on the map pointed to a full-scale pursuit, and leading that charge was none other than Patton's Third Army. In March, as the Allies prepared to cross the Rhine, the final defensive line where German leadership pinned their hopes of halting the enemy, Patton once again delivered a complete surprise. Without fanfare or lengthy preparation, he ordered a secret crossing at Oppenheim, even before Montgomery could launch his major campaign further north. German commanders had believed the Rhine would be the last bulwark to stop the Americans, but overnight, Patton breached it with the same style he had shown since Normandy: fast, clean, precise, and unexpected. Following that bold river crossing, Patton stormed into the German heartland like a thunderbolt. Strongholds, meant to serve as strategic choke points, fell one by one. The southern defensive network quickly disintegrated. In many cases, German forces had barely established their lines when Patton's tanks were already in range, and the guns had opened fire. On Wehrmacht radio channels, Patton's name was no longer just used to mark positions, it was used to warn of his velocity. That fear spread rapidly. In many areas of Bavaria and Czechoslovakia, German troops whispered of a phantom army, one that could be 100 kilometers away in the morning and at their gates by nightfall. Some German commanders were forced to retreat before even setting up their defenses, because they no longer trusted conventional estimates of Allied movement. With Patton, marching time became an unpredictable variable, and that shattered the internal coherence of German defensive plans, driving them into reactive disarray. Patton advanced so rapidly that he sometimes outpaced even the logistical support of his own army. But the Germans didn't see that. All they felt was this: wherever there was a gap, Patton would find it. Wherever hope of regrouping existed, he would crush it before it could take form. When the war ended in May 1945, Berlin fell to the Soviet Red Army. Patton, though denied the chance to march into the heart of the Third Reich, had already etched his name deep into the minds of the German High Command. Not through political symbolism or sweeping strategic influence, but through a very specific kind of tactical fear. Wherever Patton aimed, control unraveled. To the Wehrmacht, Patton was not merely a skilled adversary. He embodied relentless pressure, never allowing the enemy to breathe, never offering them the chance to recover. And that, above all, was the greatest danger. When every defensive line collapsed under speed and boldness too unpredictable to contain, the only thing a German general could do was try to guess which direction Patton would strike from next. From North Africa to the heart of Germany, from dusty deserts to the frozen valleys of the Ardennes, Patton's name surfaced in the hottest zones at the most decisive moments. Whenever the Germans thought they had regained momentum, he returned like a storm, sudden, fierce, and unforgiving. George S. Patton was no conventional, soft-spoken commander confined to operations maps. He lived on the front lines, made decisions amid mud and gunfire, and surged toward the weakest points with calculated aggression. That made him the most unpredictable and feared threat in the eyes of German commanders, because no one could foresee when, where, or how he would strike next. That fear of Patton gradually became an obsession. German officers began looking at the map not with offensive intent, but with anxious eyes waiting to see where Patton's arrow would land, rather than planning their own next move. In him, they saw more than a talented general. He was a sustained source of pressure that wore down their entire command structure day after day. They had once taken pride in Blitzkrieg lightning war as their signature strategy, but now, the man mastering those very tactics wasn't German. Patton wielded speed, mobility, and surprise with a terrifying flexibility, turning the weapon that once conquered Europe into a blade turned against its maker. And he didn't need to proclaim it, the battlefield spoke for him. Patton never reached Berlin, but he crossed the Rhine, swept through Bavaria, neared the borders of Czechoslovakia, and dismantled the last coherent defensive structure Nazi Germany had left. Inside the Nazi command, he was the spearhead to watch above all others, the man they constructed entire deception operations to mislead, afraid that one wrong move would allow him to drive straight into their core, just as he had done in France and the Ardennes. After the war, many German generals who had faced Patton recalled him with a mix of admiration and bitterness. Not because he overwhelmed them with numbers, but because he controlled the tempo of the war, something they once believed only they could do. Patton never gave the enemy time to think. He fought as if victory were inevitable, and he was simply accelerating its arrival. To America, he became a symbol of unstoppable force, of an unrelenting offensive spirit. To Germany, he embodied inescapable pressure, the cold blade slicing across their fronts, spreading defeat before they even understood why they had lost. And to the history of World War II, George S. Patton was the storm that carried the collapse of an empire, a general who gave the enemy no room to breathe, let alone strike back.